He presented this plan to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Scheer, and Scheer rejected it within 24 hours. He may not have even read the proposal. He may not have bothered. He just probably thought, this is too harebrained. We're in a life and death struggle on the Western Front, and he wants us to send 3 Zeppelins to New York City. So the idea did not get very far, and Strasser died 18 days later in the Zeppelin L-70 when they made an air raid, when they made an air attack on England. They were over the British coast, and they were there too early. The Zeppelin could still be seen because the sun hadn't gone down completely yet. Actually, the sun had gone down on the ground, but they were up high, and you could still see the Zeppelin reflecting the sunlight very nicely. The British set up planes, they shot down the L-70, and Strasser was killed. And that was the end of the German airship raids on England and anywhere else. So this plan did not get very far. But it leaves us with a lot of fascinating questions. Like, for example, could the Zeppelins have reached New York? I think it's very likely they could have. I believe so because Strasser, who knew the Zeppelins better than anybody, was convinced that the L-70 could go that far. About a year earlier, a Zeppelin was used to try to resupply a German guerrilla unit in East Africa. They ultimately had to turn back without succeeding in their mission, but in doing that, they flew 4,200 miles, and they still had enough fuel for 3,700 miles more, the same distance from Friedrichshafen to Chicago. So they certainly could have gotten to New York. I think the really questionable thing is whether they could have gotten back. Right after the war ended, Ernst Lehmann, who was one of the Zeppelin commanders, and who was later a commander, I think, on the Hindenburg, he had a plan in March 1919 to fly the L-72 to New York City and back if he had to demonstrate peaceful transport uses for airships. So there were a lot of Germans who thought, and they had some good evidence, that the Zeppelins could have reached New York City and maybe come back even. Next question, would they have been a serious threat? I don't think so. What I've got here in this table is I've got a listing of all of the Zeppelin air raids on the capital city of Paris and the 4 worst Zeppelin air raids on London by either 1 or 2 airships. The Germans were going to send 3 to New York. And you look at the numbers of people killed and wounded, and I think that if they had sent 3 airships to New York City, you probably would have had a number of people killed in the dozens, but not in the hundreds. I think it would have made a big splash. There would have been a lot written on Twitter about it. But in terms of a real impact, it wouldn't have been very, very severe. Now, interestingly enough, the U.S. Army was actually concerned about this sort of thing. And they were concerned about attacks on the U.S. coast by airships at least as far back as December 1908. An important part of our defenses back then were coastal forts. And so, starting in 1916, they decided they needed to equip our coastal forts with artillery pieces to bring down airships or other aircraft that might attack the U.S. East Coast. They had plenty of 3-inch guns that they could use for anti-aircraft weapons, but they didn't have mounts that they could use to elevate them and turn these artillery pieces into anti-aircraft weapons. So they ordered 160 gun mounts to put into U.S. forts for aerial defense. The deliveries continued until mid-1920 before they were all in place. And so at that point, we were well protected against Zeppelins attacking our coast. Okay, so closing thoughts. The creation of a new weapon, the bomber, unleashed a wave of creativity among military thinkers on how it might be used. The air power theories and ideas developed during the Great War influenced military thinking into the 21st century. Although there were often technological limits to the ideas developed during World War I, surprisingly there were also limits to atrocities that nations would commit, even in humanity's worst war up to that point. Think about bombing civilians with poison gas. Technologically very easy, nobody wanted to do it. Think about the Kaiser forbidding the bombing of royal palaces in England. And to save time, I cut out the part on biological warfare. The Kaiser also reacted very badly to one German officer's idea that they dropped plague germs from Zeppelins onto British ports. So even though there were technological limits, there were also humanitarian limits on what people would do. Sadly, some of these limits, like poison gas on civilians and firestorms, were violated just a few years later.
A few years after World War I?
I'm sorry?
You said a few years after World War I?
Yes, as early as 1919, you have poison gas attacks on civilians in Afghanistan and Pakistanis in the northwest provinces by the British, dropping mustard gas.
That's not fun.
I'm sorry?
Me?
No. I was,
Hi.
yes.
I had read in an airplane magazine about 20 or 30 years ago that Germans were working on a bomber biplane with roughly 10 engines on it that was supposed to bomb New York from German soil in 1919. The only remaining piece of the aircraft was in the Imperial War Museum. It was its 7-foot 9-inch landing wheel made out of wood. But I don't even think they even got it off the ground. Not just the wheel, but the whole thing.
Yeah. Let me repeat the question so everybody can hear it. He's asking about reports that the Germans were developing a 10-engine, you said? 10-engine bomber that could attack New York from Germany. In the preparation of this research, that was a question that intrigued me very much because I did also see reports like that. I talked to Peter Gross, who is probably was probably the late Peter Gross, who was probably the best authority on German aircraft, and he said that bomber, which was called the Pole Bomber, was never really intended for hitting New York. It was an extremely large bomber, and there is a wheel of it in some museum someplace, and I don't even know if it got off the ground. But apparently, according to Peter, it was never really intended to bomb New York, like someone else has said since then.
The wheel is supposed to be in the Imperial War Museum. I don't know.
Okay, Imperial War Museum. All right. Yes.
It is there, and in World War II, they tried once again to develop a bomber to bomb New York, developed by Messerschmitt. It was called the Messerschmitt 324 New York bomber.
Did everyone hear that?
Yeah, there was an attempt. I don't think it was ever built. It was just planned, the New York bomber.
Correct.
In World War II.
Correct.
It was a flying wing, wasn't it?
No, it was not. It was a conventional airframe, 4 engines, tricycle landing gear, and was designated the Messerschmitt 324. There was another one that was actually a skip bomber, which was incredibly advanced, but never actually took flight, which would have been powered by a rocket sled, glided above the stratosphere, bounced off several times, eventually bombed New York, and then how it would get back to Germany was a bit of a long shot. That technology was eventually used in the Apollo program to guide the reentry profile.
Could I throw something in before we have another question? And that is to do with the use of mustard gas. This was brought up by a previous speaker, like when we had another talk about World War I. And I looked into this, and in fact, there was a recent article in the Journal of Modern History by C.D. Douglas. And although Winston Churchill famously advocated using poison gas against the Iraqis in the 1920s, there's no evidence that they ever used any gas, certainly not mustard gas, maybe tear gas, but probably not. And although Major General Folks advocated using mustard gas against the Afghans in 1919, there's no evidence that they did, although in that case, that might just be because there's no evidence that they did.